obvious impacts are, despite huge profits for the transnational corporations, we're hearing about workers in the Philippines, and Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, demanding just a living wage, or the right to go to the bathroom, the right to just have a union. And I think what a lot of people outside Asia don't understand is how hard the struggle is for working people, because in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, people think Asia is the success story. And they see the huge growth in exports and what seems to be a celebration of global capitalism's success. And yet when you hear and talk to workers, you realize that the system doesn't work for them. And I think what's most telling is that in all the countries, workers are facing a very similar situation of lack of job opportunities, in precarious nature of work, attacks on social programs, welfare programs, attacks on unions. And this is happening in the Asian countries. I know it's happening in the United States. I know it's happening in Japan and Germany. So I think what we've really seen is that what makes all of this so common is a globalization process that has been driven by transnational corporations. They have knitted countries together in a way that has put pressure on workers, whether it's in Asia, where a lot of the manufacturers are produced, whether it's in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of the extractive work goes on, whether it's in the US and Japan, where a lot of the products produced in Asia are being sold. The key is that this transnational corporate system is really a system based on exports. And to be competitive, labor workers are a cost. And so all the national governments, which want to keep the transnational corporations in their country, are driven to try and create conditions that are most attractive. In some ways, China is setting the terms for that, and other countries are struggling to compete. So in Korea, which used to be a very dynamic national economy, now more than half the workers are irregular workers. Unions are under tremendous attack. But for the average worker, conditions are declining. So I think what we're really seeing is a world that's been knitted together to make profits for transnational corporations and national allies. And the commonality has produced a situation where working people in most countries are really on the defensive. They account overall for more than a quarter of total gross GDP in the world.
It was in 2010. Right?
Yes, but I think if anything, it's probably gone up because the slower growth has eroded, the profits of the smaller companies. And if you look at the U.S., for example, corporate, and here let's just talk about non-financial corporations, more of the manufacturing firms. Their profits and profits as a share of GDP are at an all-time record. You look at the leading transnational corporations, whether you're talking about the computer companies or Apple or Microsoft, all those companies, they're doing very well, and they're doing very well despite growth slowing, despite the prices being low, because this global system has enabled them to cut costs so tremendously. And so I guess there's two things to say. One is it's a system that really highlights, I think, the fact of how regressive capitalism has become. It used to be capitalism was a means to an end. And people would say, well, if things aren't going well, if we can only make a more modern capitalism, a more, capitalism, a national capitalism that fits best with the trends, will be better off. And now we see the opposite in a way, that this modern capitalist system, while it's generating profits, is repressing the wages of workers. But I think what's also important is that this is a system that has very deep contradictions. For one thing, one of the inspiring things that the meetings were at is that workers are beginning to resist increasingly effectively It doesn't take as long to convince people that this system doesn't work for them, and out of need, they're fighting back. But the other is that particularly in Asia, well, Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, in different ways, all fitting together, that whole system has been designed to export to the core countries, the U.S. in particular. The U.S. consumption accounts for about 25% of total world growth. U.S. household consumption is about $10 trillion a year. Japan is only about 2 or 3 trillion, and Germany 2 or 3 trillion. So the U.S. is the main consumer market. And what's happened with globalization, as you have companies like Apple who don't produce in the U.S., or you have companies like Dell Computers that don't produce in the U.S. jobs have disappeared. And U.S. income is back to the 1973 level.
Wow.
Now, for a while, this was masked because of all these debt bubbles, where people were borrowing on their house and they were using credit cards. They can't do that anymore. And so what that means is going forward, this global system designed to export is going to find markets harder to find. And what's going to happen? Well, companies are going to demand more from workers. And I don't even know whether they can get that. But what that says is, this is not only is this an exploitative system, it's not a stable system. Something's going to have to give. And that's the question of what's our strategy? What do we do? I mean, one thing I'm inspired at this meeting is the willingness of workers to take enormous risks and to strike and to organize. But I think militancy is not enough. You know, I've studied the Korean experience a lot, and the Korean unions are justifiably known for their incredible militancy. But, you know, in a situation where mobility is the key to capitalist power, and globalization is all about ensuring mobility, if workers strike, Korean companies say, okay, well, we're on to China, you know? And other workers say, oh my gosh, what are you doing? You're jeopardizing our ability to succeed, because if you strike and scare off foreign investment, what are we going to do? So I think that just militancy alone, or even building strong unions alone, while it's important, it is not enough. And part of the problem is, you know, unions, as they're supposed to be, are worrying about what the garment wage is or what the steel wage is. And in the global context, if you push hard to get a higher wage, you could find that global capital shifts and leaves you and your country worse off. So in my way of thinking, we need kind of a new institutions that are a little bit above unions but below political parties. For one thing, the number of workers in unions is quite low. Even in Korea, it's only about 8 or 10% of workers are now in unions. In China, they may be in unions, but they're not real unions. In the United States, unionization is about 9 or 10%. So we can't rely just on unions. We need to talk about workers, and not just workplace issues, but the broader kinds of issues of our healthcare and our infrastructure and our social programs. So one of the things that we're experimenting with in some cities in the United States, and I think maybe it would be applicable, but at least, you know, suggested for Asia, is worker assemblies, where when unions engage in actions and workers get really interested in becoming more politically active, where do they go? Sometimes unions themselves have sort of limits on the kinds of issues they want to take on. For workers who aren't in unions, how do they get involved? So, for example, in my city in Portland, Oregon, we're trying to build a workers' assembly, where when workers get interested and involved, they sort of come together. And the goal of a workers' assembly is to really help workers see the kind of broader forces that are at work. And let me give you some examples. In my city, and this is not uncommon, the government was going after the public school teachers and saying, oh, the reason that education isn't working is because teacher unions are too strong. And they went after university professors, and they said, oh, the reason that university costs too much is because professors make too much money. And they went after people who work in the parks, and they said, oh, the reason why your taxes are too high is because the workers who clean the parks make too much money. And in each case, those workers knew that the story was false for them, but they believed it about the other workers. So what we did is we got all these union leaders and workers together, and we had them tell their stories. And all of a sudden, the workers in each of these places realized, wow, you know, they weren't only lying about me, they were lying about you and you and you. And then the question is, it's not just personal to my workplace, there's something bigger going on.
Right.
Why is the state trying to break public sector unions? And how do we resist that collectively? How do we begin a process of getting the community to see that public sector unions are really crucial to having public services that are responsive to people? Or we have a number of low-wage campaigns. We had zoo workers and school bus drivers and people who worked in janitors. And there were maybe 8 campaigns. In each campaign, workers were trying to raise their wages, but no one campaign ever learned about the other campaigns. So each campaign was sort of in a little bubble. When you get all the campaigns together in a room, in a workers' assembly, and they hear about each other's struggle, then it's realization that, you know, it's not just my employer out to get me, but there's a process in the economy that's pushing down wages. So the key, I think, and where these workers' assemblies can be helpful is not only in the sense of campaigns, helping campaigns, because as in the public sector campaign, we were very successful because each of those campaigns could draw on the public sector workers from all the other places. And the low-wage campaigns, each campaign could draw on support from other low-wage workers. But workers began to raise bigger questions. Why is it that all these jobs are low-wage jobs? What's working here? Why is it that the public sector is under attack? And so when workers begin to think about these broader issues, they begin to get politically more sensitive to what's going on. And in the case of beginning to think about, well, you know, why can't states tax the corporations? Why can't they pay us higher wages? Why are they trying to privatize everything? Then you start to get to the transnational corporations and their agenda. What is it about the economy that puts pressure so that states can't tax people, that they've got to drive down wages and things to survive? So you begin to build a political movement, and those people then go back to their unions and their communities, and they can start to become leaders, and you can begin a process of challenging policies. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that although globalization predates a lot of these free trade agreements, these free trade agreements, which are strengthening globalization, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement we have now, but many, you know, ASEAN's agreements, many agreements, they make very explicit what the aim of capitalism is. When workers say, oh, we can't tax companies because they're moving around, it just seems like, well, there's not much you can do. Or if you're in competition with other workers, of course your boss has to demand lower wages. There's not much you can do. But when workers begin to study these agreements, they're called free trade agreements, and they include lowering tariffs. They include many other chapters. Chapters that allow corporations to shift money wherever they want, allow corporations to sue governments if they do anything that limits their profits. They come to realize that these are actual plans, and that when these agreements are signed, the conditions are strengthened to limit worker abilities to defend their interests. So suddenly they can see in ways that maybe they couldn't see before that the kind of economy that they're forced to deal with is being created. It's not just some magical, market, but a political process. And therefore, if they're going to resist privatization, if they're going to resist cuts on social programs, they have to fight them, and they have to fight these agreements that intensify the pressures they feel. And I think there's where you can start to build solidarity around the world.